Imagine, imagine a trench. Just a physical, brutal gash in the earth, dug by desperate hands in the freezing, biting cold of an Arabian winter.
Mm-hmm.
And on one side of this trench, you have this fledgling, incredibly fragile city-state,
Yeah.
right? Just struggling to feed its own people.
Yeah, barely surviving the winter.
Exactly. And then on the other side is a terrifying, totally unprecedented military coalition. We're talking about 15,000 heavily armed soldiers.
Ouch! For that time and place is just an astronomical number.
Right. This is the Battle of the Confederates.
Mm-hmm.
Or the Battle of Ahzab. You have the Quraysh. You have the Ghatafan tribes, the Banu Nadir.
The Midden and Jewish tribes who had broken their treaties, yeah.
Yeah, all of them just converging on Medina. Now, usually when you see a coalition of this massive scale in historical warfare, especially in this specific era, it's a raid for loot.
Of course.
It's an empire crushing a wealthy neighbor to steal their gold, their fertile lands, their resources.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing is, Medina had no wealth. They had no great treasures to steal. They didn't have sprawling, resource-rich territories. Like we said, they barely had enough food to survive the winter. So why did 15,000 warriors cross the unforgiving desert just to surround them?
Well, it is the ultimate historical paradox, right? If you try to view it through the conventional lens of military conquest, it just doesn't make sense.
It really doesn't.
The sheer logistics of moving 15,000 men and all their animals across a desert, that requires an enormous capital investment.
Right, so he's paying for all that.
Exactly. And if there is no gold in Medina to recoup that investment, the motive has to be entirely different. As Alama Parwez points out in his lecture on this was a coordinated, highly targeted assassination of an experiment.
An experiment. I like that word for it.
Yeah, because the Medina state was a threat specifically because of its socioeconomic architecture. It wasn't about land. It represented a completely new, value-driven system that fundamentally undermined the three pillars of the established global order at the time.
Okay, let's break those down.
Yeah.
What were the pillars?
So first, you had the monarchies and tribal chiefdoms, right?
Yep.
The ones which relied on absolute personal rule.
Mm-hmm.
Second, you had the capitalistic monopolies. Think about the massive trade caravans of the Quraysh, where the labor of the working class was just ruthlessly extracted to fund the luxuries of the elite.
Usually through crushing systems of usury and debt, right? Like inescapable debt traps.
Exactly, financial hostage-taking. And then third, you had the religious priesthoods, which controlled the masses through spiritual extortion, basically turning shrines into massive revenue streams.
But I am struggling to see how a tiny town in the desert threatens the entirety of the global order. I mean, I understand why the local Quraysh trade monopolists would be angry, sure.
Right, because Medina was literally sitting on their trade route to Syria.
Yeah, and Medina's zero-interest economic policies were a direct rebuke of the Meccan lending system, so that local friction makes sense. But you mentioned the global superpowers earlier. The Roman and Persian empires were watching this.
Absolutely.
Why would an emperor in Constantinople or Ctesiphon care about a few thousand people trying to build an equitable farming community in the middle of the Arabian Peninsula?
Because you have to think about the viral nature of an idea.
Okay.
The Roman and Persian empires were built on the backs of oppressed underclasses. That's just a fact. They functioned through heavy taxation, slave labor, and really rigid caste systems.
Right.
And the Medina experiment was actively dismantling all of those mechanisms of control within its own borders. It established a society where a slave and a tribal chief had the exact same legal standing.
Which is mind-blowing for the 7th century.
It's completely unheard of. And it was a place where hoarding wealth was structurally penalized, while redistribution was actually systematized. The global superpowers understood that if this radically equitable system was allowed to survive and thrive, its sheer magnetic appeal would draw the oppressed masses of the world to it.
So it's not about Medina invading Rome.
No. It wasn't a military threat to Rome or Persia at all. It was a conceptual contagion. The blueprint itself was the weapon.
Wow. I want you, listening to this right now, to really try and conceptualize this. Imagine you are part of a group trying to build a system so fundamentally dedicated to human dignity and economic equity that the existing global powers actually coordinate a massive multinational military alliance just to extinguish you before your ideas can spread.
Yeah, they aren't coming for your money. They are coming to kill the very idea of what you are building.
It's an existential threat to a concept.
And that conceptual threat is the sole reason the Ahzab coalition was even formed. Ahzab literally translates to allied forces. Parwez draws a direct parallel to the Allied forces of the World Wars.
Oh, that's interesting.
Just look at the composition of this army. You have the desert-dwelling Ghatafan mercenaries, right? They were promised a percentage of Medina's date harvest as payment.
Literally hired guns.
Exactly. Then you have the elite aristocrats of Mecca who wanted to protect their trade monopolies, and you have factions from within Medina itself who had lost their local political and financial dominance.
And historically, these groups despised each other, didn't they?
Oh, they hated each other. They fought constant, bloody tribal wars among themselves for generations. But their vested interests in the old system of exploitation temporarily united them.
The enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Right. They hit pause on their mutual hatred just to crush the one thing that threatened their shared business model, a system where human beings couldn't be exploited for profit or power.
Wait, hold on. Let me stop you there. I totally get the socioeconomic threat Medina posed. It makes perfect sense. But the primary source we are examining today, Surah Al-Ahzab, doesn't open with an economic treatise.
No, it doesn't.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because before the text even mentions the freezing winds or the trench or the battle itself, it opens with this massive roll call of prophets, Ayat 7. It names Noah, Abraham, Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad. And it mentions a firm covenant, a Meethaq taken from all of them. Now, to a layman like me, a covenant with God just sounds like a promise to pray, perform certain rituals, be a good person. Where is Parwez getting this intense socioeconomic angle from a theological list of prophets?
What's fascinating here is that to answer that, you have to look at what those specific prophets actually did in their historical contexts.
Okay.
Moses didn't just ask Pharaoh to pray differently, right? He led a massive labor strike and an exodus that essentially crippled the Egyptian economy.
Oh, wow. Yeah, taking the entire slave labor force away.
Exactly. And Jesus didn't just offer spiritual platitudes. He physically overturned the tables of the money changers who were running an exploitative financial monopoly right inside the temple.
Right. He attacked their revenue stream.
So Parwez completely deconstructs the traditional, purely theological reading of this covenant. This Meethaq, this incredibly firm, crushing pledge, was not about maintaining personal spiritual purity in a vacuum. It was the immense, overwhelming weight of carrying a systemic responsibility.
So it's not just a pledge to be a nice person.
No. The covenant was an agreement to take on the burden of overhauling a socioeconomic order.
So it's really a pledge to be a systemic disruptor.
Yes. It is a commitment to establish a social order where justice is actually operationalized. Parwez argues that God is effectively saying to these leaders, you are taking on the mission to liberate humanity from exploitation. Do you understand the reaction this will provoke?
Because when you try to dismantle a system of oppression, the pushback you receive isn't born out of a misunderstanding.
None at all.
Like, the Quraysh didn't attack Medina because they misunderstood the message of equity.
Yeah.
They attacked because they understood it perfectly.
They understood exactly what it meant for their bottom line.
They didn't need better marketing. The marketing was the threat.
Precisely. The old socioeconomic system behaves exactly like a biological organism. When a new, healthy cell is introduced, the old, corrupt system doesn't passively observe it.
Right.
It triggers a massive immune response. The Allied forces of Ahzab were essentially the immune response of the monopolistic monarchical world. The Meethaq, this heavy covenant we're talking about, is the conscious acceptance of the fact that if you build a fair society, the beneficiaries of unfairness will come to destroy it.
It is the acknowledgement of the inevitable collision between the status quo and the forces of true equity.
Yeah, you have to know what you're signing up for.
But that brings up a really crucial point. So if the system requires you to bleed for it, to face this massive immune response, what happens to the people who only join the Medina project for the perks?
Ah, the opportunists.
Yeah. Because think about anyone trying to implement real change today, like in a corporate setting. If you step into a toxic culture and try to implement genuine transparency, the people benefiting from the toxicity form a coalition to get you fired.
Always.
The resistance proves the system recognizes you as a threat. But when that massive external pressure hits, the people inside your own team undergo a really violent psychological sorting process.
Yes, the stress test begins, and Parwez's clinical breakdown of how different factions react to this stress, specifically in Ayat 12 and 13, is remarkable.
He strips away the theology again.
Yeah, completely. He moves entirely away from treating hypocrisy as a spiritual failing, analyzing it instead as a highly predictable sociological phenomenon.
Okay, so paint the picture of this phenomenon.
So, you're under the pressure of a month-long siege. Starvation is setting in. The threat of an absolute massacre is looming just on the other side of this trench.
Just a few hundred yards away.
Exactly. Under that pressure, the psychological facade of the opportunists crumbles, and the Quran actually records their exact internal logic. They say, God and his messenger promised us only deception.
Oh, wow. It's the ultimate victimhood narrative.
Right.
They reframe their own lack of commitment as a failure of leadership. I mean, I compare this to fair-weather investors in a startup.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
Right. Imagine you join an early-stage startup. The pitch is amazing, the vision is world-changing, and the initial funding rounds are incredibly successful. You have stock options, you get free lunches, and you feel like a visionary just by being in the building.
Everything is great when the money is flowing.
Exactly. But then a massive multinational conglomerate decides to crush you. They tie you up in litigation, they poach your suppliers, and suddenly your startup's burn rate, the rate at which you are bleeding cash, becomes terrifying.
A runway basically disappears, and failure seems mathematically certain.
The free snacks are gone. You are working 80-hour weeks just to keep the lights on. What happens to those fair-weather employees?
They calculate their exit.
They calculate their exit. They didn't sign up for the grind. They signed up for the IPO. So they start rationalizing their departure. They say, the CEO lied to us. The projections were a deception. They don't want to admit they lack the stomach for the fight, so they blame the system itself.
That is a flawless modern translation of the sociology occurring in the trench right there. These individuals joined the Medina Project when it seemed advantageous.
When it was winning.
Right. They saw a rising power, a cohesive community, and tangible economic benefits to being part of the in-group. They were committed to the benefits of the system, not the values.
Huge distinction.
So when the cost of their commitment suddenly skyrocketed, they initiated an exit strategy. The text explicitly documents them going to the leadership and saying, our homes are exposed.
They claimed they needed to abandon the defensive line to protect their property in the city.
Yeah, but the text clinically points out that their homes were not exposed. They merely wanted to flee. They were just making excuses to get away from the burn rate, so to speak.
And the worst part is, they don't just leave quietly.
No, they never do.
They begin a whispering campaign. The text mentions them telling others, there is no place for you here, so go back. They actively try to demoralize the remaining defenders, because if everyone quits, then my quitting is just common sense, right?
Exactly. It validates their cowardice. If the whole thing collapses, they can say, see, I was right to leave. It was doomed.
Wow. So they need the project to fail to feel okay about abandoning it.
Parwez argues that this is the inevitable sorting mechanism of any genuine systemic test. You cannot build a robust, world-changing civilization with fair-weather participants.
You just can't.
The system requires testing. The cost of commitment must become painfully high at some point to separate those who truly believe in the foundational project from those who are just riding its advantages for personal gain.
So the Siege of Ahzab, from a sociological standpoint, was really a purification process for the Medina state.
Absolutely.
The system gets expensive,
Yeah.
and you see who's actually willing to pay the price.
Yeah.
But here's where it gets really interesting. Consider the alternative reaction happening simultaneously.
Right, in verse 22.
Yeah. You have this exact same terrifying external stimulus. 15,000 troops, starvation, freezing wind, the imminent threat of annihilation. Yet it produces a wildly, almost incomprehensibly different reaction in another group of people standing in the exact same dirt.
It's incredible. The true believers are standing in the same trench, looking at the same horrifying coalition. They are just as cold, they are just as hungry, and just as physically vulnerable as the opportunists.
Probably more vulnerable since they aren't looking for an excuse to run away.
True. But when they see the Allied forces cresting the horizon, their reaction isn't, we've been deceived. Their reaction, as documented in verse 22, is, this is what God and his messenger promised us.
Okay, I'm trying to put myself in their shoes here. How does looking at a massive army that wants to kill you actually confirm your beliefs?
It sounds counterintuitive, doesn't it?
Totally. To a rational observer, an overwhelming enemy force looks like definitive proof that your project has failed. It looks like game over.
Well, it comes back to the Meethaq, that heavy covenant we discussed earlier.
Okay, connecting the dots.
They deeply understood the socioeconomic reality of what they were building. They knew that a radically equitable, value-driven system was the lethal threat to the surrounding empires of exploitation.
Right.
They were told from the very beginning of the experiment, If you build a society based on justice, the lords of injustice will try to wipe you off the map. Therefore, when the lords of injustice actually show up at the borders of the city, the believer processes that data entirely differently.
They say the prophecy is fulfilling itself.
Yes. They say the system is working so efficiently that it has provoked the exact immune response we were warned about.
Oh, man. So they didn't see the army as a sign that the mission was doomed? They saw the army as proof that they were doing exactly what they were supposed to be doing.
Exactly.
If the Quraysh and their allies hadn't shown up to destroy them, that would have meant the Medina state wasn't actually threatening the corrupt status quo. It would have meant they had compromised their values somewhere along the line.
If nobody is mad at you, you aren't changing anything.
Exactly.
Their response to the crisis was entirely determined by their prior understanding of the systemic goals. Those on the margins, who only wanted the benefits, read adversity as betrayal. But those embedded in the core read adversity as the necessary friction of systemic change.
Wow.
Parwez draws a really profound structural lesson here regarding how people develop systemic understanding. True belief in this framework isn't blind, naive faith that nothing bad will ever happen.
Right. It's not toxic positivity.
No. True belief is a highly rational understanding of cause and effect in socioeconomic struggles. It transforms trauma into data. It transforms fear into validation.
Think about the projects, the relationships, or the systems you are committed to in your own life. When things get unimaginably hard, when the funding dries up, when the cultural pushback gets really aggressive, when you're exhausted and shivering in your own metaphorical trench, how do you process that resistance?
It's a huge question.
Do you view that crisis as a betrayal? Do you start looking for an exit strategy, like the fair-weather startup employees? Or do you look at the resistance and say, of course this is hard. I am challenging the status quo, and this pushback is confirmation that my work actually matters.
It is a completely different paradigm for experiencing hardship. But sustaining that paradigm requires a very specific type of leadership.
Let's dig into that, because it's one thing to have this grand intellectual realization about socioeconomic friction when you're sitting in a classroom. It's another thing entirely to hold the line for 30 days while your children are starving in the city behind you and the guy next to you in the trench is whispering about plotting a mutiny. How does a leader actually hold a fractured, terrified society together under those conditions?
So Parwez directs our attention to the operational core of the narrative in verse 21, which provides the actual template for managing this exact scenario.
What does the text say?
The text states, "In the messenger of God, there is a beautiful example for those who hope in God in the last day." The term used for beautiful example is uswa hasana.
Uswa Hisana, the beautiful pattern,
Yeah.
the excellent example.
Yes. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, Parwez is incredibly emphatic about deconstructing how this verse has been traditionally interpreted over the centuries.
Because it's usually interpreted as a guide for personal behavior, right?
Exactly. Often, Uswa Hisana has been reduced to imitating the prophet's personal physical habits. How he dressed, what he ate, which foot he stepped into a room with, his daily routines in a state of peace. Now, while historical tradition obviously holds value, Parwez argues that applying this verse primarily to personal habits completely ignores the explosive context in which the verse was revealed.
Oh, right. The verse doesn't drop down while everyone is sitting comfortably having a theological debate over tea.
No.
The verse is revealed in the middle of a brutal, freezing, month-long siege where the very survival of this socio-economic experiment is hanging by a thread.
Precisely. The uswa, the example being pointed to by the text, is behavioral and systemic. It is about how a leader remains a functional, unbreakable anchor of stability under the absolute maximum threshold of existential threat.
It's like, think of the load-bearing pillar in a skyscraper during a massive earthquake.
Oh, that's good.
The pillar doesn't run around trying to stop the ground from shaking. It can't. It doesn't panic. It just maintains its structural integrity so the floors above it don't collapse. Parwez is saying the prophet's uswa was acting as that load-bearing pillar for the entire society.
That is precisely what systemic leadership looks like in this framework. The beautiful example during the Battle of Ahzab was how he managed the treachery of the opportunists without letting the society tear itself apart from the inside out through, paranoia or bloody purges.
Because paranoia would have destroyed them faster than the army outside.
Exactly. It was how he kept the desperate, starving believers anchored to the mission. History actually records that the prophet was working down in the trench, literally breaking rocks alongside the defenders, constantly projecting vision and stability.
He didn't just preach faith from a safe distance. He operationalized it under fire.
He held the structural line.
So Uswahi Hassana, in this context, poses a very specific set of questions for anyone in leadership. How do you behave when 15,000 people are actively trying to kill your idea?
Right.
Do you panic? Do you compromise your core values just to appease the coalition? Do you turn on your own people to save your own skin? Or do you stand firm, maintain the integrity of the system, and guide your people through the darkest night?
And that standard is crucial, because a value-driven system cannot survive if its leadership cracks under pressure.
It all comes crumbling down.
The Ahzab coalition was literally banking on the leadership cracking. They assumed the freezing winds, the starvation, and the internal betrayals would cause the Medina experiment to just implode organically. They thought they wouldn't even have to fight.
But that load-bearing pillar held the societal structure together long enough for the storm to break.
Yes.
And it literally was a storm that broke it. So what does this all mean? Parwiz's ultimate synthesis of this event shifts the entire paradigm of how we view victory.
Totally.
Because if you look at this historical record, this month-long siege wasn't resolved by a massive cinematic clash of swords where the Median army charged out of the trench and completely routed the coalition.
No, it was not a military conquest in the traditional sense at all. After a month of this grueling standoff, the stalemate was broken by a horrific, freezing weather event, an absolute tempest that ripped through the coalition's camp.
Just a freak storm.
It overturned their tents, it terrified their animals, and it destroyed whatever remaining supplies they had. And remember, the coalition was already fractured by internal distrust.
Right. The Ghatafan wanted their date harvest. The Quraysh were hemorrhaging money just maintaining the siege. And none of them were used to this type of protracted sit-and-wait warfare.
Exactly. So when the storm hit, they simply broke apart and retreated.
They just gave up. The immune response failed to destroy the new cell. The victory wasn't in killing the enemy. The victory was in surviving them.
Yes, the battle proves that a radically equitable, value-driven social order can actually survive a coordinated global attempt at its elimination, provided its leadership holds the structural line and its core believers understand the absolute necessity of the struggle.
It is a profound case study in systemic resilience. The Battle of Ahzab didn't just expose the opportunist and confirm the believers. It demonstrated to the surrounding empires that the Medina state could not be bullied out of existence.
It established the permanent viability of a society built on justice rather than exploitation. They proved they could take the hardest hit the world could throw at them and still be standing.
Which leaves you, listening to this, with a lingering, deeply personal question. If a true systemic test, like a month-long siege in the freezing cold, is the only mechanism capable of stripping away the fair-weather participants and revealing the people who are deeply, truly committed to the core values, perhaps the crises we face in our own modern institutions aren't the disasters we think they are. What if the breakdowns, the friction, the loss of funding, the cultural pushback, and the seemingly impossible pressures you are facing right now aren't signs that your project is failing? What if they are the exact necessary sorting mechanisms required to figure out who actually believes in the world you are trying to build? What if the storm is just revealing the strength of your trench?